This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV. This Week in Virology, a special episode recorded, I don't know what today is, May 6th? May 6th, 2025. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. We have a special episode for you today. Coming back, many visits to TWiV. David Tuller, who is Senior Fellow in Public Health and Journalism in the Center for Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome back, David.
Thanks, Vincent. Good to be here.
Good to see you again. And
one of my regular visits to New York.
You reminded me that 10 years ago you published your long article on the PACE trial in Virology blog.
Yeah, that was 10 years ago in October. So it'll be 10 years, and I had been working on it for a year before that. So I sent you this, 15,000 word sort of thing. Then at first it was going to run on 3 days and then 4 days. So it actually ended up running in 4 parts over 3 days.
Why did you pick me? I forgot what was.
Well, you and I had sort of talked. You and I had connected earlier in the. Not in the PET. Earlier in the XMRV.
That's right. It was
situation.
XMRV. Yeah.
Because you had sort of. I think you had said something and then said, "Oh, you shouldn't have said that." I forget what it was, and then somehow we talked, or I quoted you in a story. I was doing stuff for the New York Times then, and then I had a long thing that was also quite many words about the case definition in what was then being called chronic fatigue syndrome and how the CDC had screwed up the case definition all over the place. So you actually ran that in 2011. And so then I was writing this thing about the PACE trial, and I was sort of couldn't figure, it was supposed to go on retraction watch, and we had some differences. And so then I thought, well, maybe you'd be interested in it because you had become more interested in. So as a result of the XMRV situation, the purported mouse retrovirus that supposedly was connected to chronic fatigue syndrome turned out to be a lab contaminant. You and many other people involved with microbiology had recognized, I think, that there really did seem to be a lot of elements of what was then again called chronic fatigue syndrome that definitely seemed to be sort of related to infectious illness. So I think your interest in the whole area grew after that.
And you have been writing since.
I've been writing since. And so, for a while I was just doing it on my own because I had another job at Berkeley, and I would send you things and you'd post them.
Right.
And then after about a year and a half, my position at Berkeley, or maybe 2 years, my position at Berkeley changed, and my, funding ran out, as tends to happen. And that's when the Dean of Public Health said, well, you have this other project you're doing. Why don't you crowdfund that, donations to Berkeley, and we can keep paying you? And I was like, I can crowdfund my academic position? I'd never heard of anything like that. He said, we don't care. You're an academic. Bring us money. We don't care where it comes from. So that's what I started doing. And so basically, amazingly, I've managed to do that for the last 7-8 years. And to support, the money goes to Berkeley, not to me directly. And then Berkeley pays my salary.
All right. So let me ask you the hard question right away.
Yep.
So we have this head of HHS, RFK Jr., who is not a scientist. He's a lawyer and a propagandist, a liar, a misinformationist. And he says we have to give infectious diseases a break. And he's been taking apart the NIH and the CDC and the FDA and cutting back infectious disease research. No more COVID research. Cut third of HIV/AIDS, probably more. Anyway, he wants to focus on, he says, chronic diseases. So last I heard, MECFS and long COVID are chronic diseases. Is there any indication that he's going to fund more research?
No, I mean he's definitely funding in that area is being trashed as well as funding in many other areas, and he doesn't seem to recognize that some of these major chronic diseases do arise out of infectious some cancers as well, by that infectious agents. And so it just seems incredibly short-sighted, especially if you think every chronic disease is related solely to food dyes. And, as much as it's good to get artificial things out of the food supply, including dyes and including high fructose corn syrup or whatever food substitutes and sugar substitutes and sugar. Those aren't the only causes of everything, and they're not necessarily. He presumes he's going to find by September the causes of autism. I don't know what he thinks he's going to be announcing in September, but he'll probably announce maybe it's related to food dyes. And if we just get rid of food dyes, we'll have no more autism. So it's all a bunch of insanity, obviously. And so, this domain is affected a lot.
I know that in Colombia had a long COVID program with CDC, and that was
right. So Ian Lipkin had a Center for MECFS, I think it was called, and so that was part of the the hostage money that was the money that was taken hostage, and the $400 million that was first canceled. Right. But I'm not sure now of the status. Some of that money is kind of tied up in lawsuits, and just overall. So as far as I know, that has not been restored. But the problem is, if you cut money off and then restoring it 3 months later or 9 months later is not the same thing, because you have studies that have been abandoned or samples that you can't keep, in a good place or whatever it is. It's just devastating.
Well, personnel too. You can't keep them. You let them go, and then you have to retrain people.
Well, right, and nobody wants to work in an agency that's in the process of self-destruction. It's an unpleasant environment to work in, especially if you're treated like you're a problem, which is, just in general. What's shocking to me is that we're so mean. We're so mean. We apparently hate everybody. We hate all federal workers. We hate all researchers. We hate all academics. Everybody's, part of this. So that whole element of the country has become so mean about everything. It's not just that we're firing people, like we relish throwing them off the job.
What's the point of withdrawing funding for PBS and NPR, for example? It's meanness, right?
It is, but from their perspective, I think they really see those as indoctrinating people into, trans, or, some Muppet has ambiguous sexuality and it's suddenly becoming, you're trying to influence 3-year-olds to become trans. So, I think they really, in their minds, there is some justification for it. It's hard to understand because it does seem so twisted. But, I think... I assume there must be some rationale along those lines.
Well, but
with this, I don't understand, because all the cutting of these, a lot of the COVID money, like to health departments and stuff, to local and state health departments, was being used for pandemic preparedness.
Yeah.
And obviously we should be prepared. As we've learned, it's good to be prepared for pandemics.
No, the excuse that the pandemic is over is a non-excuse, because most of those funds, as you say, were for preparedness or trying to make antivirals for other viruses, not a lot related to.
Right. So it was in the larger sense, it was COVID related, but it was in the larger sense related to let's prepare. And the problem is also public health it's a problematic field, because you're preparing for things that you don't know if they're going to happen. And then if they don't happen, well, why did we waste all that money on this stuff? Or if it doesn't happen because you prevented it, you don't know that it didn't happen. So then you don't know how bad it could have been if you hadn't prevented it. So then you don't see the damage. Like, let's take all the fluoride out of all the water. Well, we're going to see a wave of, in 10 years, kids with horrible tooth decay, especially in disadvantaged neighborhoods where they're not getting regular dental care, or their parents aren't telling them to brush their teeth, twice a day. So, and by then it's too late for those things. Maybe we'll have a counter generation that will then have fluoride in water again, but all these things have downstream effects that they don't seem to think, oh, we just cut the money now and there's no cost later, as if, you just save the money that you're not spending now, and that's the end of the story.
I mean, the USAID, for example, program,
it's terrible.
Enormously beneficial for many countries. It's mean to cut it.
It's killing people. We're killing people around the world, by withdrawing that money. And maybe somewhere in Thailand, someone thought about doing a transgender cartoon. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure they probably did. But, it's like just to cut off all this funding for, America first, whatever that means. What does that mean?
It's nonsense. It's nonsense. The thing is, David, what bothers me is that there's a small cadre of racists and misogynists who want this. They wrote that plan for 2025. Remember that? Whatever it's called. Under the guise of being conservative Christians, but they're not. They're just bigots and misogynists. And they figured out how to insinuate themselves into the Republican Party and take it over. And this is where we are now. And they have their own ideas about how things should be. And they don't fit with most Americans, but most Americans don't get the right news because they listen to Fox. And this is part of the problem.
I think also I find it really offensive as an American Jew that the idea that they're using, quote, their concern about, quote, their purported concerns about anti-Semitism to crack down on universities is horrifying to me. I mean, they don't care about, Trump doesn't care about anti-Semitism. He's the biggest anti-Semite on the block.
That's right, exactly.
It's all just an excuse, and so it's really just disgusting.
Well, the demands have nothing to do with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, the demands have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. We're going to cut off all your research for cancer unless you fix your anti-Semitism,
Well, it's just petty nonsense. It's the way they bully people, right? Unfortunately. But what do you think is going to happen to public health and science? It's at the moment being severely harmed, right? Is it in 2 years, can we recover if we have a Congress?
It's interesting because before the election, I was talking to some colleagues, so I don't get any federal grants, so I'm not really in that space. But I don't think that anybody everybody was worried he'd get in, and people, I think, thought that their 2-year or 3-year grants would run out and then they wouldn't get re-upped in the next round. I don't think anybody really anticipated coming in and just slashing grants in the middle and even trying to claw back money that had already been paid out. I think that was a complete shock to the system because nobody does that. You don't do that. I mean, you do it if there's really malfeasance, I guess, on somebody's part, but you don't just go and decide after grants have been awarded that you're just cutting them off with no warning, when everything's already in progress. So, I mean, I don't. That takes a while to figure out how to deal with, and besides all the legal issues.
Legal issues take a long time to sort out.
Well, and also, like you say, I mean, it just puts a huge. It's very hard to see graduate students, or certainly not as many graduate students, unless they're independently wealthy, coming, because if they can't be sure that they're going to get funding from their faculty mentors, then where are they going to get funding from? Certainly not the National Science Foundation at this point. And this is also, like I was going to apply with a colleague in medical anthropology. We've been talking about it for the last year. She was very interested in sort of the whole how do diseases get framed and how to, with all the stuff about diseases with hard to define boundaries, and defined by symptoms as opposed to biomarkers, and how does that get adjudicated, and all the things that we were going to apply maybe to the National Science Foundation. And we were starting to put together concepts and stuff. And then once the election happened, and I said, let's forget about it, because it seemed like, why would they even be interested? Well, Trump wasn't, I didn't have any anticipation they were going to cut off whatever but it just seemed there was a grant deadline in February. And I was like, let's not even bother putting in the time, because what's the point? But of course, by then they'd already canceled that possibility. But, you sort of stop anybody wanting to bother to apply for grants. So it's an effective deterrent to anybody sort of pursuing science to a certain degree. Every time Kennedy opens his mouth, he says something stupider than the last time. So I guess we'll just see. I think it's going to be devastating to public health. It depends upon, to some degree, the ironic thing is that the red states will suffer more. The blue states have a bit more resources and can scramble, and their state health departments can probably fill in some gaps that are easier for them than in poorer states. But the states that are going to suffer the most are the rural red states that voted for Trump.
I saw a statistic that a good fraction of Republicans don't even know there's a measles outbreak currently.
Oh, is that true? Because Fox hasn't talked about it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the Kennedy, obviously his response to that's been pretty terrible. And, just the level of threats that people get for, saying vaccines don't cause autism or, whatever it is that they say. So it's a very bad environment at the moment.
All right, let's talk about some chronic diseases. I went through your blog posts and picked out a couple of things we could discuss. So as we said, well, in 2011, the PACE trial was published, right?
That was the first, yes. So that was the first publication of the PACE trial. And you and I were already in communication then, because that was also when XMRV was going on. And I hadn't heard about, if I had been in England, I would have known about the PACE trial because it was big news all through its development.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anything about it.
Okay.
So that was when it first came out, yeah.
So they claimed that graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy had a good impact on people with MECFS.
Right. So their idea was that it was essentially what they were then calling psychosomatic, which is a term now not used as much anymore, but that they basically thought that people got a viral illness, then they got very deconditioned because they were sick. Then they would try to do something, and because they were deconditioned, they wouldn't feel good, and they would think, oh, I'm still sick. I have to go back to bed and rest more. And they'd get more and more deconditioned and sleep, and their sleep would go off, and then you get depressed, and then you get muscle atrophy, and they posited that there was a, quote, downward vicious cycle that patients would get. And so they posited that you needed to intervene in one of two ways. It's essentially one treatment. You want to get people back to doing things, but you can either change them cognitively and nudge them cognitively to rethink how they think about So they decided that they had false ideations about having an ongoing illness. So if you change those false ideations, then you can also encourage them to do a little more. So that's primarily structuring them cognitively, but also getting them to do more. On the other side, graded exercise therapy was, well, let's just nudge them to do a little more. And as they're doing more, they'll see that they don't get worse, and then we'll work on them cognitively. Mm-hmm. So they're essentially one therapy, but sort of broken into two, with one predominantly cognitive and one predominantly, behavioral. But they're essentially both have components of either, so they attempted those two. And, they did really bad things that really qualify as research misconduct, I think, by any definition. And I've often referred to it as fraudulent in the sense of, misleading on purpose as opposed to legally fraud, because I don't know legal definitions. But, they definitely changed all their outcome measures to weaken all their measures, and they reported better results, and then they refused to provide their raw data, and that led to a court case. And then after that, that the data were liberated from the university because they lost in court, and that led to reanalyses that showed they really had no substantive findings to begin with. But the thing with that was that by 2021, if things had changed enough in the period of time that I've been working on this, and attitudes had changed enough that in the UK, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, called NICE, NICE, which does sort of recommendations for treatment, or does sort of review, guidelines for managing various illnesses. And they came out with a new guidance for MECFS, which rescinded their prior recommendations for graded exercise therapy and for cognitive behavior therapy as a cure. They still recommended therapy or cognitive behavior therapy possibly as supportive, but not based on the idea that patients had a false ideation of their illness. It acknowledged that patients actually had illness. And so at that point, I thought I could maybe start to think about ending the project. But then long COVID was happening, and all the exact same researchers who had spent that time debunking much of it on Virology blog were doing the exact same studies that they had done, like PACE, about long COVID with the same problematic methodological flaws and the same kind of assumptions that these patients were suffering from not, pathophysiological things going on in their bodies, but from post-traumatic stress disorder from the pandemic and anxiety and depression and, again, false ideations about having an ongoing illness and that kind of thing. And so they were applying the exact same definition to that. And in the interim, I'd also seen that they were doing the exact same thing with other illnesses that sort of fall into that general category of kind of, chronic illnesses that we don't actually have biomarkers for, that in many cases seem to be after an acute infection of some kind.
So these efforts on long COVID didn't bear any fruit, just like the PACE trial didn't.
Well, they tend to find, so they all have the same general format, which is that they're unblinded in the sense that everybody knows what intervention they're getting, which is sort of inevitable when you're doing behavioral or therapeutic psychotherapy. But they all rely solely on subjective measures. And so that's a problem because we have no biomarkers for them. But like in the PACE trial, when they have objective measures of function, like how far people could walk on the 6-minute walking test or a step test measuring fitness. They go on a step stool up and down. Or again, things about like whether they get back to work or whether they get off benefits, and all those fail to show any substantive improvement or anything that would be clinically significant. Now they ignored the fact that their objective measures showed nothing, and they focused just on the fact that they got marginal benefits in their subjective outcomes. And if you have an unblinded study with an outcome that says, how do you feel at the end, you're almost automatically going to get probably some bias in the answers from the people who got the intervention when other people knew they didn't get the intervention, and there's nothing to measure except their hope and expectation. So if you're getting only marginal improvements and you have to weaken all your outcome measures to even show those, then you're not getting much improvement at all. So these have often, like some of them that I've written about, they're of that ilk. So they have a rehabilitation program and other people get care as usual. So one group already knows what they're getting. And they have some final score, which is basically a measure of how do you feel in any number of ways on any number of instruments. And often, they'll find that, yes, there is some measured improvement, but it tends to be, or in several cases, it's been that are high prominent studies that then get promoted. It's actually below the level, that the threshold that is considered clinically significant for that measure. So the point being that many health scales have a measure that, if it's a 100-point scale and there's only a 5-point improvement, it actually only a 10-point improvement is considered clinically significant. That the 5-point improvement might be statistically significant, but it's not really perceptible to the individual. So it's not really a clinically, it's like if you can walk 3 inches more, well, that may be statistically significant, but if you wanted to walk 5 miles more and not just 3 inches more, it really has no practical meaning. So in some of these studies, there's, an acknowledged, for many of these instruments, there's sort of an acknowledged threshold, like 10 points of what is considered that from previous work with that scale. And so these studies will say this is the threshold, but then their own points, their own outcomes fall below that. And they'll still say it was significant because it was statistically significant, and they won't. And the findings, the conclusions of the study will say, we found that it was effective in reducing blah blah. But only in the discussion or something will it say, well, we were below the threshold, and then they'll give some excuse for why that might be. So that's really not okay. I mean, you can't really promote it as clinically effective if, in fact, you fell below the threshold that's considered clinically effective for that measure. But that seems to be a constant with these studies. So they're doing the same kind of thing where, they're getting marginal benefits. and then they're reporting it as if the benefits are really good. So I haven't seen as much. It's more they're doing it sort of more. I think it's bad, but it doesn't rise. It hasn't, in most cases, it doesn't seem to rise to the level of what the PACE authors did. That sort of set the template also for this kind of study in these kinds of domains, because often they all reference the PACE trial and they'll reference it approvingly without any mention of all the controversy around it. Like there's prior studies have shown that cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy are effective in treating chronic fatigue syndrome. They'll reference the PACE study, but they won't mention that there's counter things and all that kind of thing. So they're just working within that paradigm.
Unfortunately, the study needs to be withdrawn before people will stop citing it, right? And
that's one of the things. Like, well, it hasn't been withdrawn, so they can still keep citing it, which of course is true. And all that I say, well, it's discredited. And I think it's discredited, but if it's not officially withdrawn, then so there's really been kind of an ongoing war in this domain, especially fierce in the UK, because what happened when the NICE guidelines came out was that there was a fierce counter-reaction from the physicians, the psychiatrists, and sort of the cabal, because the whole system was geared towards the paradigm of psychosomatic illness that the PACE trial had kind of not pioneered, because it had already been, they'd already been going with that, but was sort of the PACE trial was sort of created to ratify what they were already doing. And it reinforced it around the world. And so all the people invested in that, including not first and foremost the Lancet, which had, Richard Horton, the editor, had invested some political capital in defending the PACE trial. And he already had problematic issues given his publication of the Wakefield paper on vaccines and autism in 1998, which he waited a very long time to retract. So he came out defending the PACE trial, and I think that really makes it harder to see how it ultimately gets retracted. But I think it's obvious that the authors have recognized that their work, is, they really had sort of full reign over this field, and now they don't. Now there's competing narratives. So even though the PACE trial is still in the literature, they don't have full control over they've lost control of the narrative. And I think that's really important. If you're looking at it objectively and you mention PACE, you have to mention that there's a counter narrative to that whole paradigm. I think long COVID has made that obvious. I think one thing that's a mystery to me is how you can look at MECFS sometimes would seemingly occur in clusters, and most of the time when doctors see it, it occurs in sporadic cases. This person gets, something and they don't get better, or that person. But here you have the same phenomenon happening all around the world in every country, more or less simultaneously. And so either you can think, gee, something's going on. And we've always known that with viruses especially and other infections, some small percentage don't get better. That's not an unknown fact.
That's correct.
So here we see this, and we see this on a worldwide basis, and you can either think something's really going wrong with these people's bodies, or you can think we're having a mass hypnosis thing of some kind. And I just don't really get why. Not that I have such faith in people's intelligence exactly, but I just don't see the reason for going in the mass. People can have things, but most people aren't going to have so much PTSD that they're going to be unable to work for the next 5 years. That doesn't make any sense to me.
What are some of the other narratives for MECFS that have arisen?
You mean of the origin of it?
Yeah.
Well, I think, there have always been clusters of throughout the 20th century, there are multiple reports of these clusters of seemingly infectious illnesses and some people not getting better. And so no one really knows if those are what those were those, they all seem to think there seems to be some idea that many of these were enteroviruses like polio. And so there seems to be a particular link possibly with enteroviruses.
Well, they're just so common probably that they made a link, but it's not necessarily causative, right?
That could be. I mean, they thought that they never, and so the one that gave rise to the name myalgic encephalomyelitis was the Royal Free outbreak in England in the 50s, in London in the 50s. And again, they didn't isolate a pathogen. But in 1970, and after that, they coined it as benign myalgic encephalomyelitis, although the benign sort of has fallen out of use. But in 1970, then two British, one psychiatrist and a psychiatrist, I think he was in training. Anyway, they wrote a paper basically reanalyzing that 1950s outbreak as a mass hysteria. And one of the main reasons why they said that was that most of the victims were women. They were nurses at the hospital. So since they were women, it was ergo much more likely that it was mass hysteria than if they were men. So that was one of their main arguments. And so that sort of started the counter-narrative, in England that led to ultimately we have this big split. And with long COVID, we saw that this split really emerged because very quickly those who were reporting prolonged symptoms were being accused of having mental illness and just suffering from anxiety, by high-profile medical people. And immediately the counter-narrative arose because people who were familiar with ME or people who knew that, acute infections tend to yield a number of people who continue to have sequelae, were not predicted this would happen, while the medical world in general seemed very surprised to have this. So it shouldn't have been a surprise. But I think it's easier for governments. The PACE authors and some of their colleagues have been consultants and advisors to disability insurance companies and to government agencies in the UK and elsewhere that want to save money. And so it's much easier to save money if you say, well, we just need a 4-week course of CBT or a 6-week course of graded exercise therapy than if these people need long-term social welfare payments. And so I think some of the big imperative in terms of promoting these ideologies really, because they're not really based on the science suggests that these treatments don't work in these cases. I think a lot of the imperative is that it would seem to be a money-saving strategy.
So how about biomarkers? Have we made any progress in something you can measure in a clinical trial? Right?
So there's something's happening. It's part of one of the difficult things with all of these is that these are all probably a cluster of related illnesses. So it's likely that ME or MECFS, there's a whole controversy. MECFS, some people really hate that term because it's sort of not, it's a hybrid of two vague concepts to begin with. So anyway, there's a lot of dispute over the definition, but because all of these things are probably a cluster, it can be hard to, that can confound any findings that you may have. So it has been hard to find consistent biomarkers. But some of the long COVID research is starting to yield things that can be sort of looked at as potential biomarkers. And the one biomarker that there is, or what's considered a biomarker, but the problem is it causes, some damage or harm, is to do one of these 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise tests. So if you exercise on one day, the people with MECFS, and so long COVID is, of course, many, many things, including identifiable organ damage and people who think they have something. But if we're talking about the long COVID patients who have sort of this very similar cluster of symptoms that ME patients have. So they'll do a bicycle test on the first day, and in terms of measuring the gases coming out and so on and their ability, they'll do maybe more or less comparable to healthy people. And then if you come back the next day, when they're presumably suffering in the middle of their post-exertional malaise, you'll get a marked difference in the gas composition coming out, which shows that they're reaching their anaerobic threshold at a much lower level than the healthy people. And so patients will sometimes, that's what the studies show. So that's a biomarker. And the patients might do that if they need it for disability, to prove something to a disability or employment, something that they actually truly have a disability that can be measured. But nobody really wants to do it because they'll go into a relapse from the post-exertional malaise.
Okay.
So there's nothing yet in terms of a blood test, though, again, those are things that they're looking at, and, hopefully they're trying, different people are trying to study some compounds as treatments in long COVID. And, it's hoped that whatever's found for long COVID will be able to reflect back, because some of the mechanisms are probably quite similar. Even if this is a virus we haven't seen before, which has some of its own effects, it seems like some of the mechanisms are similar and some of the symptoms are certainly similar.
Does anyone... So I presume MECFS is still diagnosed?
Yeah.
So does anyone have a diagnosis after COVID?
So many people will get a COVID, will get a long COVID diagnosis, but then they'll also get an MECFS diagnosis. Okay. Like because MECFS, long COVID just means you have something after COVID. MECFS is a specific cluster of symptoms that qualify under the MECFS diagnosis. So long COVID, even though it's used as diagnosis, is really a broader category that, again, you might say you have headaches 4 months after your infection, so you might say you have long COVID even if you have no other symptoms. So it's not, in some ways it's a useful term because it's all encompassing. In other ways, it's very vague and covers a lot of ground, and probably also includes people who don't have long COVID because maybe their COVID it was only suspected COVID, or it was a presumed COVID infection and they didn't have it, but they're still having some symptoms. So, yeah.
So you wrote a blog post on failed treatment for MECFS, rituximab.
Yeah.
So why did people think that might work?
Well, that had to do with that was a trial that came out a few years ago. And the reason I wrote about it again now is to compare it to another trial that was a trial for functional motor disorder. But the rituximab trial, it's used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, and there's some idea that one of the theories is that whatever infection people have that then triggers them to have MECFS or ME is sort of creating an autoimmune kind of dysfunction. And so there've been some early indications that treatment with this drug might help. And so they did like a phase 2 trial where they had some benefit. So, but in this bigger trial, it failed. And the point was that the failure forced the researchers to think about what they were doing, as opposed to some of these other, some of the trials in these kind of medically unexplained symptom conditions where the trial doesn't do well, but they never rethink their symptoms. They just rethink their assumptions. They just they either say, well, we think we had the wrong primary outcome because the secondary outcome did well, or they come up with some other reason why the primary outcome may not have done well, but they don't actually challenge their thinking or come up with some other reason, why things might be the way they are.
Rituximab is an antibody against B cells, so that would be immunosuppressive, right?
And one of the people was, and there was a lot of hope for that, and it seemed like maybe there was some, again, because the patients probably are a heterogeneous bunch. It may be that there is a subset that would benefit from rituximab. So there's kind of quite a few things like that. That there seem to be some people who seem to get genuine benefit, but if you look at it across the population, it's unclear, or it doesn't seem, like Ampligen is a drug that some people seem to get, or benefit from, but it has not done as well as might have been expected, in other ways. And the same with, a couple of other compounds that some people find really helpful or report that it's helpful, other people don't. And some people can get it because it's, off-label or whatever, but some other ones are very hard to get.
So both vaccination and Paxlovid have been shown to have some effect on long COVID.
Well, definitely vaccination has been shown to have, reduce rates and reduce the severity, and seems to also reduce the likelihood of long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And Paxlovid, I'm not sure it seems that I'm not sure what the current is on it. They've gone back and forth whether it, I'm not sure if it actually reduces anything. They were testing for long COVID. I think they found in one study that the amount that they used did not have an impact, but I don't think it was the last word.
Well, if you already have long COVID, in my view, there's no virus that Paxlovid would inhibit.
Right.
But if you get an initial SARS-CoV-2 infection and then take Paxlovid right away,
right?
Then there's a decrease in.
That's what they say. Although then there's also the question of the relapse, and so there seems to be that idea of the Paxlovid relapse, but then other people say no, there's relapse anyway, so there's not really
that's right.
There's substantially higher relapse with Paxlovid.
Well, the infection is biphasic, right? There's a viral phase, then there's an inflammatory phase, which you may or may not have, and it's not caused by Paxlovid. People call it Paxlovid rebound, but as you say, it's part of the natural pathogenesis.
Right. So anyway, I think, obviously people want things right away, understandably, especially if they're sick.
Of course.
And so it's hard to, like I always feel bad because I've been working on this for 10 years, but I'm not in the business. I can only say what's bad science on the non-answers. I can't actually figure out what the answers are. I'm just trying to get rid of some of the bad stuff that's in the way of the smart people trying to get the good answers. And so in a way, I feel like it's useful function, but it's not, it's like a clearing the way function to get rid of this morass of nonsense that's been blocking things and chip away at it. And I think that's been helpful in other things being able to come forward, but I don't think anybody's come up with the answers yet.
So you wrote a couple of columns on what you call the Cochrane Mess and the Sick Times. What is the Sick Times?
So the Sick Times is a really good publication. They started about a year and a half ago. There were two young journalists who were writing about COVID and long COVID, or young, in 30s. So to me, that's young. Betsy Ladyjets and Miles Griffiths, and so they started this publication, and they basically cover long COVID, and they also cover kind of related to that MECFS, but basically they're covering long COVID and politically and socially and sort of culturally, and they started off just the two of them and just decided, okay, let's, and then they started, then they have subscribers, and now they have some, they got some grant funding. And so, I think they're really kind of doing a good job. And for me, it's useful because I read a lot about England, and because mainly a lot of the research I was criticizing comes from the UK and less from the US. So I've generally focused in my thing more. So the folks at the Sick Times have really kept up more on the US side of developments with the NIH and stuff. And so I wrote about so Cochrane does, based in UK, but they have affiliates in every country, and they've had it's very complicated, but they do
meta-analyses
or systematic reviews of treatments for various conditions. And they did a study of exercise therapies for chronic fatigue syndrome, which went through multiple versions starting from 2002 when they first developed the protocol. And then 2019 was the last version. And there was a big war about that being published at the time. It was right before the pandemic, so nobody realized that all of these guidelines and recommendations related to MECFS have huge implications for long COVID. And so if there were big fights before, once long COVID started happening, they became proxy fights over long COVID, because how you then say you're going to treat MECFS, you kind of need to apply some of the same logic to the cases of long COVID, especially where patients have post-exertional malaise. So this fight happened, and Cochrane, at that point in 2019, published this version that was basically recommended exercise, albeit somewhat tepidly because the data weren't great, but they still recommended exercise based on their review of multiple studies, and the largest one of which was the PACE trial, which they considered a good quality study. And there was a big controversy over it. And at the time, the editor-in-chief said, well, we're publishing this, but we realize there are still outstanding questions, and we're starting a whole new process to work on that and do a new updated review with a new team. So in December, that in itself had started to become a burden to them, and they had some other political problems over a mask study they did the year before that caused them some controversy. So when this, which there was a whole thing about, in 2023 about this mask review of masks, effectiveness of masks. And so last year, at the end, they suddenly dropped. They just made an announcement that we're leaving the 2019 review up, and we're dropping this new review we said we were going to do. And they said, well, there's no sufficient new evidence, and we don't have the resources. And it really was kind of completely bogus, because the reason to do it wasn't based on whether there was or was not new studies. It was based on the fact that the other one was inadequate for multiple reasons, including the fact that it didn't take into account any of the objective findings from the studies, including the PACE trial, which, as we've talked about, had null results. And so the protocol that was written many years before didn't include the objective findings, and so those weren't it. So there were reasons why it was time to do a new review, regardless of whether there was any new. Yeah. So that was just a made-up premise. They just didn't want to deal with it, and so that's why I started going on about the Cochrane Chronicles, or and the Cochrane screwing. I said the Cochrane to community, fuck off. I mean, basically that was because that's what they're saying. It was a very, very flat clinical statement, and without any kind of appreciation that they were just pulling the wool out, pulling the rug out from under all these patients who were, hoping that they would do this. So there's been some victories, and then there's that, and that's still kind of a fight that's going on. Cochrane, there are a lot of calls to put a stronger advisory on the old review, saying this should not be used for clinical advice if you don't want to withdraw it, but that hasn't happened yet. They've made slight changes to how the editorial note is phrased, and a sign that I think that they're feeling some pressure, but they haven't done what they really need to do.
Okay. You also wrote about a Norwegian long COVID trial. What was that about? Which didn't sound very good either, because you're pointing out flawed things.
Yeah, the Norwegian one, God, there have been so many, but that was one of the ones that fell under. It was a short. They were claiming like in 3 days, I think, that everybody was better or something. But again, it was one where the difference, if I remember correctly, was a less than the minimal clinically important difference for that measure. And so, they had people who said they felt better, but
what did they do? Like, what was the treatment?
The treatment was a short rehab.
Or like exercise?
Sort of, it would include exercise and some cognitive stuff going on and that kind of stuff. It would be a mix of cognitive and physical therapy, or kind of exercise rehab. And again, people who get something are going to say they feel better if you ask them how they feel. Either they like the therapist, or they want to feel. Some may really feel better. It's not that it's impossible, but. But there's any number of reasons in that kind of study where you're going to have bias just built into the study design. Sure. And people saying they feel better out of expectation bias or some sort of hopefulness bias, or whatever one would want to call it, and you're not really measuring anything.
That's come up many times today. You have to be able to measure something. You can't just ask people.
Well, I think if you're giving them a drug, and you're giving the other ones a placebo,
that you can hide, sure.
Then they don't know what they're getting. And then if one group consistently says they're happy and the other group says they're miserable, then that actually means something.
Sure. Okay.
But if you know that you're giving one group, I mean, basically in the PACE trial, you look at the manuals for the patients and for the therapists, and the manuals are full of statements like, CBT has been shown to help people, or GET in other studies has been shown, constantly the message that this, and part of the effect is inducing a placebo effect, because that induces you to increase your responses on a questionnaire by 1 or 2 points. And that automatically makes the trial successful. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to increase people's responses on questionnaires. And if you're telling them constantly or routinely that they're getting something and that the other people are not being told that because they're not getting anything, it doesn't, you don't need to be a genius to figure out how that's going to trend.
Right.
So I think that's the general problem with all of these studies. And then they come up with very marginal findings that are really not out of what you would expect from exactly that. And so one of the studies I think the headline was, trial proves that, studies with unblinded studies with subjective outcomes will produce modestly positive results. That was a cognitive behavior study from the Netherlands about cognitive behavior therapy for, fatigue associated with COVID. And in that one, what they had some marginal improvements reported in cognitive behavior therapy, but they actually used actometers, devices to measure how far people walked after the therapy, and they didn't do any better. They didn't report those findings in the paper. Well, why not? Well, they didn't because they didn't do any better.
Yeah.
They didn't walk any farther. And then when they were asked why, they claimed, well, that has nothing to do with whether you're tired. I mean, fatigue has nothing to do with how far you walk. And it's like, no, that's actually not true. And that's contrary to what you've argued in previous papers. And you obviously use this. They also said, well, it wasn't a primary or a secondary outcome. It was just some other outcome. And I'm like, you don't get to do that. You don't get to decide that because it's not a primary or secondary outcome, if it shows evidence against your findings, you don't get to exclude it. That's research misconduct.
Yes, agreed.
So that kind of thing you find, and I have a whole kind of list of all the things all the strategies that you can use in these kinds of studies to amplify your very minimal findings. Get your university to issue a great press release. That's another strategy.
Yes.
Have a colleague write a complimentary commentary accompanying it, amplifying your findings, even though they're basically non-existent, or reinforcing your interpretation of what you'd like to say. All those things happen in all these journals.
All right, a couple more questions. In one of your posts, you talk about a phrase you'd never heard before, effort preference.
Yeah, so that was in the NIH major study
of MECFS.
Well, it was so before COVID, they were going to do this big study, a very deep look at everybody, have them there for 2 weeks and do all sorts of tests and for a small cohort. And they only ended up getting about 20 or 17 or something like that. And then COVID happened, and they sort of semi-abandoned that thing because they were focused on COVID. But they ended up publishing this based on what they had, and they did this. They did this test based on using your fingers to click a button and win, hypothetical amounts of money on a thing, and they used that to test whether, and they had the concept called effort preference, which they later claimed was unconscious, not what it sounds like, which is like you're deciding that you'd prefer to spend your time on this rather than that. Like I'd prefer to go to the movies rather than go to a play. They insisted that there was an unconscious thing, but the whole structure, this was set up, this test was created to assess whether depressed college students would be more likely to expend their energy on this or that, or how they would divide their energy if they had perceived based on rewards, that they would give less energy to things that they thought had less reward, and it was all based on how much money they would get for each completed successful task. And the tasks were basically using your fingers to click on a button. But the test depended on it not being that even the most, if you did it more quickly or you did it more slowly, it didn't stress you physically. Like you could do 90 things on your little pinky as easily as you could do 20 ones on your dominant forefinger, and it wasn't an effort. But that isn't actually the case with the patients they were testing, because the patients they were testing, it really was harder for them, given that they had MECFS. It was much harder for them to do some of it than the other, and the test depended upon that not. And even the guy who founded the test, instead, well, I don't know that it was, I'm saying this from memory, he was interviewed and he said, well, this wasn't really applying for this kind of situation. So the NIH got really, really, really severely criticized by the patient community for that study and for that focus. And that effort preference became kind of the main thing in the press release. And when you're talking about a community that's for many years has been told that all they need to do is make a little more effort and they'll get better, it's really insulting. I mean, it's basically whatever they found, it's as bad as calling it chronic fatigue syndrome in the first place, which had so many negative consequences of using that term. To have something that will automatically lead doctors or clinicians to say, you just need to put in some more effort,
yes,
is really, really a bad construct.
Yes, it sounds
And so apart from the stupidity of the test itself in this situation, as it seemed, there was the stupidity of naming it effort preference when they could have called it something else. And when they apparently say that they meant it, they didn't mean it as a conscious effort, which is what most normal people would think. Effort is a conscious thing. You're not, you put effort into it. It's not usually unconscious.
Right. Wow.
So that was a real problem, and they spent a lot of money on that study. And the problem is they put in charge, one of the big criticisms of the NIH for doing that is they put in charge of actually doing the study a guy at NIH who was often, in the past has expressed the idea that these diseases were psychosomatic, were based on psychological things or fibromyalgia, that they were not organic or diseases that were based on pathophysiology. So he really came into it with that background, and people were upset. So this seemed to sort of justify or to ratify that concern as completely legitimate.
Okay.
So.
All right.
Thank you, Vincent.
One more quick one.
Yeah.
So you think that long COVID has risen awareness of MECFS?
Yeah. So there was a lot of issues in the beginning, especially. There was a very mixed feeling because nobody wanted more people to be sick. On the other hand, it was recognized that this was going to happen, and people were saying, well, there's going to be all these people. They're going to have MECFS or something like it. They're going to be told that they have psychogenic issues or it's psychological. And so people were learning about that. But then I think there was also a little bit of jealousy isn't the right word, but kind of like, well, we've been sick all this time and suddenly long COVID happens and they're throwing money at it. And of course, as we see, some of that money hasn't been well spent. But I think there was, and there was a sense of competition to some degree, and different groups had different feelings about it. But I think there was also very quickly a sense that many of the long COVID groups were working with the MECFS groups, and the MECFS groups recognized that many of the long COVID patients were would get MECFS diagnoses. So I think there's been some trying to hash out those relationships. But I think overall that it's clear that the long COVID situation has brought attention to MECFS, and to that whole complex of, post-acute infectious syndromes or infection-associated IACs, infection-associated chronic conditions. There's several terms that are being used to apply to that, and there have been some calls for a national institute devoted to that, although, of course, we're reducing the number of national institutes we have at the moment, so the idea of that happening is highly unlikely. Since we don't really want to look at infectious diseases anymore, apparently, according to RFK Jr. But I think there definitely has given, I think we've seen a worldwide natural scientific experiment in which, after a pandemic, a huge number of people remain too sick to work or remain severely disabled. And I think that's definitely, just because more people are affected, has given, rise to some more empathy or sympathy for that. And especially because some of the most affected are, doctors and healthcare workers. Mm-hmm. And again, people who are hardworking, who are not the kind of people who have any reason, psychologically, unconsciously or not, to, essentially destroy their careers by being sick. Nobody wants to destroy their life and their, not destroy, but, limit their life to such a degree that it basically alters everything that they've done up till then. But that's what's happened to so many people. And it's hard to, see that and then think, oh, they just need to
do some exercise,
or they just, they're cognitively impaired because they're just, anxious or something.
Yeah. Okay.
So
it's a special episode of TWiV. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. You can send questions or comments to twiv@microbe.tv. And if you enjoy these science programs, we'd love your financial support. We don't do any advertising. We depend on your contributions. You can go to microbe.tv/contribute for the different ways you can help us out. My guest today is a senior fellow in public health and journalism at the Center for Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, David Tuller. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Vincent.
Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, Ronald Jenkins for the music, and Jolene Ramsey for the timestamps. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.